Book 6, Chapters 1 through 4 of On War, Volumes 2 and 3, by Karl von Clausewitz, translated by J. J. Graham. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Book 6, The Defence, Chapter 1, Offence and Defence. Reader's note: this chapter is divided into enumerated sections. The first of these is 1. Conception of defence. End reader's note. What is defence in conception? The warding off a blow. What is then its characteristic sign? The state of expectancy (open bracket), or of waiting for this blow (close bracket). This is the sign by which we always recognise an act as of defensive character, and by this sign alone can the defensive be distinguished from the offensive in war. But inasmuch as an absolute defence completely contradicts the idea of war, because there would then be war carried on by one side only, it follows that the defence in war can only be relative, and the above distinguishing signs must therefore only be applied to the essential idea or general conception. It does not apply to all the separate acts which compose the war. A partial combat is defensive if we receive the onset, the charge of the enemy. A battle is so if we receive the attack, that is, wait for the appearance of the enemy before our position and within range of our fire. A campaign is defensive if we wait for the entry of the enemy into our theatre of war. In all these cases the sign of waiting for and warding off belongs to the general conception, without any contradiction arising with the conception of war, for it may be to our advantage to wait for the charge against our bayonets, or the attack on our position or our theatre of war. But as we must return the enemy's blows if we are really to carry on war, on our side, therefore, this offensive act in defensive war takes place more or less under the general title defensive, that is to say, the offensive of which we make use falls under the conception of position or theatre of war. We can, therefore, in a defensive campaign fight offensively. In a defensive battle we may use some divisions for offensive purposes, and lastly, while remaining in position awaiting the enemy's onslaught, we still make use of the offensive by sending at the same time balls into the enemy's ranks. The defensive form in war is therefore no mere shield, but a shield formed of blows delivered with skill. 2. Advantages of the defensive. What is the object of defence? To preserve. To preserve is easier than to acquire, from which follows at once that the means on both sides being supposed equal, the defensive is easier than the offensive. But in what consists the greater facility of preserving or keeping possession? In this, that all time that is not turned to any account falls into the scale in favour of the defence. He reaps where he has not sowed. Every suspension of offensive action, either from erroneous views, from fear, or from indolence, is in favour of the side acting defensively. This advantage saved the state of Prussia from ruin more than once in the 7 Years' War. It is one which derives itself from the conception and object of the defensive, lies in the nature of all defence, and in ordinary life, particularly in legal business, which bears so much resemblance to war, it is expressed by the Latin proverb beati sunt possidentes. Another advantage arising from the nature of war, and belonging to it exclusively, is the aid afforded by locality or ground. This is one of which the defensive form has a preferential use. Having established these general ideas, we now turn more directly to the subject. In tactics, every combat, great or small, is defensive, if we leave the initiative to the enemy and wait for his appearance in our front. From that moment forward we can make use of all offensive means without losing the said two advantages of the defence, namely, that of waiting for and that of ground. In strategy at first the campaign represents the battle, and the theatre of war the position, but afterwards the whole war takes the place of the campaign, and the whole country that of the theatre of war, and in both cases the defensive remains that which it was in tactics. It has been already observed in a general way that the defensive is easier than the offensive, but as the defensive has a negative object, that of preserving, and the offensive a positive object, that of conquering, and as the latter increases our own means of carrying on war, but the preserving does not, therefore, in order to express ourselves distinctly, we must say that the defensive form of war is in itself stronger than the offensive. This is the result we have been desirous of arriving at. For although it lies completely in the nature of the thing, and has been confirmed by experience 1,000 times, still it is completely contrary to the prevalent opinion, a proof of how ideas may be confused by superficial writers. If the defensive is the stronger form of conducting war, but has a negative object, it follows of itself that we must only make use of it so long as our weakness compels us to do so, and that we must give up that form as soon as we feel strong enough to aim at the positive object. Now, as the state of our circumstances is usually improved in the event of our gaining a victory through the assistance of the defensive, it is therefore also the natural course of war to begin with the defensive and to end with the offensive. It is therefore just as much in contradiction with the conception of war to suppose the defensive the ultimate object of the war, as it was a contradiction to understand passivity to belong to all the parts of the defensive, as well as to the defensive as a whole. In other words, a war in which victories are merely used to ward off blows, and where there is no attempt to return the blow, would be just as absurd as a battle in which the most absolute defence, passivity, should everywhere prevail in all measures. Against the justice of this general view, many examples may be quoted in which the defensive continued defensive to the last, and the assumption of the offensive was never contemplated. But such an objection could only be urged if we lost sight of the fact that here the question is only about general ideas (abstract ideas), and the examples in opposition to the general conception we are discussing are all of them to be looked upon as cases in which the time for the possibility of offensive reaction had not yet arrived. In the 7 Years' War, at least in the last 3 years of it, Frederick the Great did not think of an offensive. Indeed, we believe further that, generally speaking, he only acted on the offensive at any time in this war as the best means of defending himself. His whole situation compelled him to this course, and it is natural that a general should aim more immediately at that which is most in accordance with the situation in which he is placed for the time being. Nevertheless, we cannot look at this example of a defence upon a great scale without supposing that the idea of a possible counterstroke against Austria lay at the bottom of the whole of it, and saying to ourselves, the moment for that counterstroke had not arrived before the war came to a close. The conclusion of peace shows that this idea is not without foundation even in this instance, for what could have actuated the Austrians to make peace, except the thought that they were not in a condition, with their own forces alone, to make head against the talent of the king, that to maintain an equilibrium their exertions must be greater than heretofore, and that the slightest relaxation of their efforts would probably lead to fresh losses of territory. And in fact, who can doubt that if Russia, Sweden, and the army of the German Empire had ceased to act together against Frederick the Great, he would have tried to conquer the Austrians again in Bohemia and Moravia. Having thus defined the true meaning of the defensive, having defined its boundaries, we return again to the assertion that the defensive is the stronger form of making war. Upon a closer examination and comparison of the offensive and defensive, this will appear perfectly plain. But for the present we shall confine ourselves to noticing the contradiction in which we should be involved with ourselves, and with the results of experience by maintaining the contrary to be the fact. If the offensive form was the stronger, there would be no further occasion ever to use the defensive. As it has merely a negative object, everyone would be for attacking, and the defensive would be an absurdity. On the other hand, it is very natural that the higher object should be purchased by greater sacrifices. Whoever feels himself strong enough to make use of the weaker form has it in his power to aim at the greater object. Whoever sets himself the smaller object can only do so in order to have the benefit of the stronger form. If we look to experience, such a thing is unheard of as anyone carrying upon a war upon two different theatres, offensively on one with the weaker army, and defensively on the other with his strongest forces. But if the reverse of this has everywhere and at all times taken place, that shows plainly that generals, although their own inclination prompts them to the offensive, still hold the defensive to be the stronger form. We have still in the next chapters to explain some preliminary points. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2. The relations of the offensive and defensive to each other in tactics. First of all, we must inquire into the circumstances which give the victory in a battle. Of superiority of numbers and bravery, discipline, or other qualities of the army we say nothing here, because as a rule they depend on things which lie out of the province of the art of war in the sense in which we are now considering it. Besides which, they exercise the same effect in the offensive as the defensive, and moreover also The superiority in numbers in general cannot come under consideration here, as the number of troops is likewise a given quantity or condition, and does not depend on the will or pleasure of the general. Further, these things have no particular connection with attack and defence. But irrespective of these things, there are other three which appear to us of decisive importance. These are surprise, advantage of ground, and the attack from several quarters. The surprise produces an effect by opposing to the enemy a great many more troops than he expected at some particular point. The superiority in numbers in this case is very different to a general superiority of numbers. It is the most powerful agent in the art of war. The way in which the advantage of ground contributes to the victory is intelligible enough of itself, and we have only one observation, which is that we do not confine our remarks to obstacles which obstruct the advance of an enemy, such as scarped grounds, high hills, marshy streams, hedges, enclosures, etc. We also allude to the advantage which ground affords as cover under which troops are concealed from view. Indeed, we may say that even from ground which is quite unimportant, a person acquainted with the locality may derive assistance. The attack from several quarters includes in itself all tactical turning movements, great and small, and its effects are derived partly from the double execution obtained in this way from firearms, and partly from the enemy's dread of his retreat being cut off. Now, how do the offensive and defensive stand respectively in relation to these things? Having in view the three principles of victory just described, the answer to this question is that only a small portion of the first and last of these principles is in favour of the offensive, whilst the greater part of them and the whole of the second principle are at the command of the party acting defensively. The offensive side can only have the advantage of one complete surprise of the whole mass with the whole, whilst the defensive is in a condition to surprise incessantly throughout the whole course of the combat by the force and form which he gives to his partial attacks. The offensive has greater facilities than the defensive for surrounding and cutting off the whole, as the latter is in a manner in a fixed position, while the former is in a state of movement, having reference to that position. But the superior advantage for an enveloping movement, which the offensive possesses, as now stated, is again limited to a movement against the whole mass, for during the course of the combat, and with separate divisions of the force, it is easier for the defensive than for the offensive to make attacks from several quarters, because, as we have already said, the former is in a better situation to surprise by the force and form of his attacks. That the defensive in an especial manner enjoys the assistance which ground affords is plain in itself. As to what concerns the advantage which the defensive has in surprising by the force and form of his attacks, that results from the offensive being obliged to approach by roads and paths where he may be easily observed, whilst the defensive conceals his position, and until almost the decisive moment remains invisible to his opponent. Since the true method of defence has been adopted, reconnaissances have gone quite out of fashion, that is to say, they have become impossible. Certainly reconnaissances are still made at times, but they seldom bring home much with them. Immense as is the advantage of being able to examine well a position, and become perfectly acquainted with it before a battle, plain as it is that he (the defensive) who lies in wait near such a chosen position can much more easily effect a surprise than his adversary, yet still to this very hour the old notion is not exploded that a battle which is accepted is half lost. This comes from the old kind of defensive practised 20 years ago, and partly also in the 7 Years' War, when the only assistance expected from the ground was that it should be difficult to approach in front (by steep mountains, slopes, etc., etc.), when the little depth of the positions and the difficulty of moving the flanks produced such weakness that the armies dodged one another from one hill to another, which increased the evil. If some kind of support were found on which to rest the wings, then all depended on preventing the armies stretched along these points, like a piece of work on an embroidery frame, from being broken through at any point. The ground occupied possessed a direct value at every point, and therefore a direct defence was required everywhere. Under such circumstances, the idea of making a movement or attempting a surprise during the battle could not be entertained. It was the exact reverse of what constitutes a good defence, and of that which the defence has actually become in modern warfare. In reality, contempt for the defensive has always been the result of some particular method of defence having become worn out (outlived its period), and this was just the case with the method we have now mentioned, for in times antecedent to the period we refer to, that very method was superior to the offensive. If we go through the progressive development of the modern art of war, we find that at the commencement, that is, the 30 Years' War and the War of the Spanish Succession, The deployment and drawing up of the army in array was one of the great leading points connected with the battle. It was the most important part of the plan of the battle. This gave the defensive as a rule a great advantage, as he was already drawn up and deployed. As soon as the troops acquired greater capacity of manoeuvring, this advantage ceased, and the superiority passed over to the side of the offensive for a time. Then the defensive sought shelter behind rivers or deep valleys, or on high land. The defensive thus recovered the advantage, and continued to maintain it until the offensive acquired such increased mobility and expertness in manoeuvring that he himself could venture into broken ground and attack in separate columns, and therefore became able to turn his adversary. This led to a gradual increase in the length of positions, in consequence of which, no doubt, it occurred to the offensive to concentrate at a few points, and break through the enemy's thin line. The offensive thus for a third time gained the ascendancy, and the defence was again obliged to alter its system. This it has done in recent wars by keeping its forces concentrated in large masses, the greater part not deployed, and where possible concealed, thus merely taking up a position in readiness to act according to the manoeuvres of the enemy as soon as they are sufficiently revealed. This does not preclude a partially passive defence of the ground. Its advantage is too great for it not to be used 100 times in a campaign. But that kind of passive defence of the ground is usually no longer the principal affair. That is what we have to do with here. If the offensive should discover some new and powerful element which it can bring to its assistance, an event not very probable, seeing the point of simplicity and natural order to which all is now brought, then the defence must again alter its method. But the defensive is always certain of the assistance of ground, which ensures to it in general the natural superiority, as the special properties of the country and ground exercise a greater influence than ever on actual warfare. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3. The relations of the offensive and defensive to each other in strategy. Let us ask again, first of all, what are the circumstances which ensure a successful result in strategy? In strategy there is no victory, as we have before said. On the one hand, the strategic success is the successful preparation of the tactical victory. The greater the strategic success, the more probable becomes the victory in the battle. On the other hand, strategic success lies in the making use of the victory gained. The more events the strategic combinations can in the sequel include in the consequences of a battle gained, the more strategy can lay hands on amongst the wreck of all that has been shaken to the foundation by the battle, the more it sweeps up in great masses what of necessity has been gained with great labour by many single hands in the battle, the greater will be its success. Those things which chiefly lead to this success, or at least facilitate it, consequently the leading principles of efficient action in strategy, are as follow: 1. The advantage of ground. 2. The surprise, let it be either in the form of an actual attack by surprise, or by the unexpected display of large forces at certain points. 3. The attack from several quarters (all three, as in tactics). 4. The assistance of the theatre of war by fortresses and everything belonging to them. 5. The support of the people. 6. The utilisation of great moral forces. Now, what are the relations of offensive and defensive with respect to these things? The party on the defensive has the advantage of ground, the offensive side that of the attack by surprise in strategy, as in tactics. But respecting the surprise, we must observe that it is infinitely more efficacious and important in strategy than in tactics. In the latter, a surprise seldom rises to the level of a great victory, while in strategy it often finishes the war at one stroke. But at the same time, we must observe that the advantageous use of this means supposes some great and uncommon, as well as decisive, error committed by the adversary. Therefore it does not alter the balance much in favour of the offensive. The surprise of the enemy, by placing superior forces in position at certain points, has again a great resemblance to the analogous case in tactics. Were the defensive compelled to distribute his forces upon several points of approach to his theatre of war, then the offensive would have plainly the advantage of being able to fall upon one point with all his weight. But here also the new art of acting on the defensive by a different mode of proceeding has imperceptibly brought about new principles. If the defensive side does not apprehend that the enemy, by making use of an undefended road, will throw himself upon some important magazine or depot, or on some unprepared fortification, or on the capital itself, and if he is not reduced to the alternative of opposing the enemy on the road he has chosen, or of having his retreat cut off, then there are no peremptory grounds for dividing his forces, for if the offensive chooses a different road from that on which the defensive is to be found, then some days later the latter can march against his opponent with his whole force upon the road he has chosen. Besides, he may at the same time in most cases rest satisfied that the offensive will do him the honour to seek him out. If the offensive is obliged to advance with his forces divided, which is often unavoidable on account of subsistence, then plainly the defensive has the advantage on his side of being able to fall in force upon a fraction of the enemy. Attacks in flank and rear, which in strategy mean on the sides and reverse of the theatre of war, are of a very different nature to attacks so called in tactics. First, there is no bringing an enemy under two fires, because we cannot fire from one end of a theatre of war to the other. 2. The apprehension of losing the line of retreat is very much less, for the spaces in strategy are so great that they cannot be barred as in tactics. Third, in strategy, on account of the extent of space embraced, the efficacy of interior, that is, of shorter lines, is much greater, and this forms a great safeguard against attacks from several directions. Fourth, a new principle makes its appearance in the sensibility which is felt as to lines of communication, that is, in the effect which is produced merely by interrupting them. Now, it confessedly lies in the nature of things that on account of the greater spaces in strategy, the enveloping attack, or the attack from several sides, as a rule, is only possible for the side which has the initiative, that is, the offensive, and that the defensive is not in a condition, as he is in tactics, in the course of the action to turn the tables on the enemy by surrounding him, because he has it not in his power either to draw up his forces with the necessary depth relatively, or to conceal them sufficiently. But then, of what use is the facility of enveloping the offensive, if its advantages are not forthcoming? We could not therefore bring forward the enveloping attack in strategy as a principle of victory in general, if its influence on the lines of communication did not come into consideration. But this factor is seldom great at the first moment, when attack and defence first meet, and while they are still opposed to each other in their original position, it only becomes great as a campaign advances. When the offensive in the enemy's country is by degrees brought into the condition of defensive, then the lines of communication of this new party acting on the defensive become weak, and the party originally on the defensive, as in assuming the offensive, can derive advantage from this weakness. But who does not see that this casual superiority of the attack is not to be carried to the credit of the offensive in general, for it is in reality created out of the superior relations of the defensive? The fourth principle, the assistance of the theatre of war, is naturally an advantage on the side of the defensive. If the attacking army opens the campaign, it breaks away from its own theatre, and is thus weakened, that is, it leaves fortresses and depots of all kinds behind it. The greater the sphere of operations which must be traversed, the more it will be weakened (by marches and garrisons). The army on the defensive continues to keep up its connection with everything, that is, it enjoys the support of its fortresses, is not weakened in any way, and is near to its sources of supply. The support of the population as a fifth principle is not realised in every defence, for a defensive campaign may be carried on in the enemy's country, but still this principle is only derived from the idea of the defensive, and applies to it in the majority of cases. Besides, by this is meant chiefly, although not exclusively, the effect of calling out the last reserves, and even of a national armament, the result of which is that all friction is diminished, and that all resources are sooner forthcoming, and flow in more abundantly. The campaign of 1812 gives, as it were in a magnifying glass, a very clear illustration of the effect of the means specified under principles 3 and 4. 500,000 men passed the Niemen, 120,000 fought at Borodino, and much fewer arrived at Moscow. We may say that the effect itself of this stupendous attempt was so disastrous that even if the Russians had not assumed any offensive at all, they would still have been secure from any fresh attempt at invasion for a considerable time. It is true that, with the exception of Sweden, there is no country in Europe which is situated like Russia, but the efficient principle is always the same, the only distinction being in the greater or less degree of its strength. If we add to the fourth and fifth principles the consideration that these forces of the defensive belong to the original defensive, that is, to the defensive carried on in our own soil, and that they are much weaker if the defence takes place in an enemy's country and is mixed up with an offensive undertaking, Then from that there is a new disadvantage for the offensive, much the same as above, in respect to the third principle, for the offensive is just as little composed entirely of active elements as the defensive of merely warding off blows. Indeed, every attack which does not lead directly to peace must inevitably end in the defensive. Now, if all defensive elements which are brought into use in the attack are weakened by its nature, that is, by belonging to the attack, then this must also be considered as a general disadvantage of the offensive. This is far from being an idle piece of logical refinement. On the contrary, we should rather say that in it lies the chief disadvantage of the offensive in general, and therefore from the very commencement of, as well as throughout, every combination for a strategic attack, most particular attention ought to be directed to this point, that is, to the defensive which may follow, as we shall see more plainly when we come to the book on plans of campaigns. The great moral forces which at times saturate the element of war, as it were, with a leaven of their own, which therefore the commander in certain cases can use to assist the other means at his command, are to be supposed just as well on the side of the defensive as of the offensive. At least those which are more especially in favour of the attack, such as confusion and disorder in the enemy's ranks, do not generally appear until after the decisive stroke is given, and consequently seldom contribute beforehand to produce the result. We think we have now sufficiently established our proposition that the defensive is a stronger form of war than the offensive, but there still remains to be mentioned one small factor hitherto unnoticed. It is the high spirit, the feeling of superiority in an army which springs from a consciousness of belonging to the attacking party. The thing is in itself a fact, but the feeling soon merges into the more general and more powerful one, which is imparted by victory or defeat, by the talent or incapacity of the general. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4. Convergence of attack and divergence of defence. These two conceptions, these forms in the use of offensive and defensive, appear so frequently in theory and reality that the imagination is involuntarily disposed to look upon them as intrinsic forms necessary to attack and defence, which however is not really the case, as the smallest reflection will show. We take the earliest opportunity of examining them that we may obtain once for all clear ideas respecting them, and that in proceeding with our consideration of the relations of attack and defence, we may be able to set these conceptions aside altogether, and not have our attention forever distracted by the appearance of advantage and the reverse which they cast upon things. We treat them here as pure abstractions, extract the conception of them like an essence, and reserve our remarks on the part which it has in actual things for a future time. The defending party, both in tactics and in strategy, is supposed to be waiting in expectation, therefore standing, whilst the assailant is imagined to be in movement, and in movement expressly directed against the standing adversary. It follows from this necessarily that turning and enveloping is at the option of the assailant only, that is to say, as long as his movement and the immobility of the defensive continue. This freedom of choice of the mode of attack, whether it shall be convergent or not, according as it shall appear advantageous or otherwise, ought to be reckoned as an advantage to the offensive in general, but this choice is free only in tactics, it is not always allowed in strategy. In the first, the points on which the wings rest are hardly ever absolutely secure, but they are very frequently so in strategy, as when the front to be defended stretches in a straight line from one sea to another, or from one neutral territory to another. In such cases the attack cannot be made in a convergent form, and the liberty of choice is limited. It is limited in a still more embarrassing manner if the assailant is obliged to operate by converging lines. Russia and France cannot attack Germany in any other way than by converging lines, therefore they cannot attack with their forces united. Now, if we assume as granted that the concentric form in the action of forces in the majority of cases is the weaker form, then the advantage which the assailant possesses in the greater freedom of choice may probably be completely outweighed by the disadvantage, in other cases, of being compelled to make use of the weaker form. We proceed to examine more closely the action of these forms, both in tactics and in strategy. It has been considered one of the chief advantages of giving a concentric direction of forces, that is, operating from the circumference of a circle towards the centre, that the further the forces advance, the nearer they approach to each other. This fact is true, but the supposed advantage is not, for the tendency to union is going on equally on both sides. Consequently, the equilibrium is not disturbed. It is the same in the dispersion of force by eccentric movements. But another and a real advantage is that forces operating on converging lines direct their action towards a common point. Those operating on diverging lines do not. Now, what are the effects of the action in the two cases? Here we must separate tactics from strategy. We shall not push the analysis too far, and therefore confine ourselves to the following points as the advantages of the action in tactics. 1. A cross fire, or at least an increased effective fire, as soon as all is brought within a certain range. 2. Attack of one and the same point from several sides. 3. The cutting off the retreat. The interception of a retreat may be also conceived strategically, but then it is plainly much more difficult because great spaces are not easily blocked. The attack upon one and the same body from several quarters is generally more effectual and decisive. The smaller this body is, the nearer it approaches to the lowest limit, that of a single combatant. An army can easily give battle on several sides, a division less easily, a battalion only when forced in mass, a single man not at all. Now, strategy, in its province, deals with large masses of men, extensive spaces, and considerable duration of time. With tactics, it is the reverse. From this follows that the attack from several sides in strategy cannot have the same results as in tactics. The effective fire does not come within the scope of strategy, but in its place there is something else. It is that tottering of the base which every army feels when there is a victorious enemy in its rear, whether near or far off. It is therefore certain that the concentric action of forces has an advantage in this way, that the action or effect against A is at the same time one against B, without its force against A being diminished, and that the action against B is likewise an action against A. The whole, therefore, is not A plus B, but something more, and this advantage is produced both in tactics and strategy, although somewhat differently in each. Now, what is there in the eccentric or divergent action of forces to oppose this advantage? Plainly, the advantage of having the forces in greater proximity to each other and moving on interior lines. It is unnecessary to demonstrate how this can become such a multiplier of forces that the assailant cannot encounter the advantage it gives his opponent unless he has a greater superiority of force. When once the defensive has adopted the principle of movement (movement which certainly commences later than that of the assailant, but still time enough to break the chains of paralysing inaction), then this advantage of greater concentration and the interior lines tends much more decisively, and in most cases more effectually, toward victory than the concentric form of attack. But the victory must precede the realisation of this superiority. We must conquer before we can think of cutting off an enemy's retreat. In short, we see that there is here a relation similar to that which exists between attack and defence generally. The concentric form leads to brilliant results, the advantages of the eccentric are more secure. The former is the weaker form with the positive object, the latter the stronger form with the negative object. In this way, these two forms seem to us to be brought nearly to an even balance. Now, if we add to this that the defence, not always being absolute, is also not always precluded from using its forces on converging lines, we have no longer a right to believe that this converging form is alone sufficient to ensure to the offensive a superiority over the defensive universally, and thus we set ourselves free from the influence which that opinion usually exercises over the judgment whenever there is an opportunity. What has been said up to the present relates to both tactics and strategy. We have still a most important point to bring forward, which applies to strategy only. The advantage of interior lines increases with the distance to which these lines relate. In distances of a few thousand yards or half a mile, the time which is gained cannot, of course, be as much as in distances of several days' march, or indeed of 20 or 30 miles. The first, that is, the small distances, concerns tactics, the greater ones belong to strategy. But although we certainly require more time to reach an object in strategy than in tactics, and an army is not so quickly defeated as a battalion, still these periods of time in strategy can only increase up to a certain point, that is, they can only last until a battle takes place, or perhaps over and above that, for the few days during which a battle may be avoided without serious loss. Further, there is a much greater difference in the real start in advance, which is gained in one case as compared to the other. Owing to the insignificance of the distances in tactics, the movements of one army in a battle take place almost in sight of the other. The army, therefore, on the exterior line will generally very soon be made aware of what his adversary is doing. From the long distances with which strategy has to deal, it very seldom happens that the movement of one army is not concealed from the other for at least a day, and there are numerous instances in which, especially if the movement is only partial, such as a considerable detachment, that it remains secret for weeks. It is easy to see what a great advantage this power of concealing movements must be to that party who, through the nature of his position, has reason to desire it most. We here close our considerations on the convergent and divergent use of forces, and the relation of those forms to attack and defence, proposing to return to the subject at another time. End of Book 6, Chapter 4. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia.